My sister just called me a bastard, I said quietly, staring at the $1 bill she had thrown across the table. The room was full of relatives, neighbors, and my stepfather's business partners, yet no one said a word. Catherine stood at the head of the table with a wine glass raised like she was making a toast at a celebration. "Let's stop pretending tonight," she said, smiling as if the humiliation were a joke meant to entertain everyone. "Everyone here deserves to know the truth." The dollar bill slid to a stop in front of me. "Take it," she added. "Maybe it'll help you find wherever you really belong." My stepfather Daniel didn't stop her. In fact, he leaned back in his chair with the same cold expression he had worn for most of my life. Then he said the sentence I had expected to hear for years. "There is no place for you in this house." No one in the room knew that I had been waiting for this moment longer than any of them could imagine. I slowly reached into my bag and pulled out a thick envelope, placing it calmly on the table between the plates and half-empty wine glasses. "That's fine," I said, "because I've known the truth for a long time." A few relatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Catherine frowned, confused by how calm I sounded. I slid the envelope forward with one finger, and the person waiting outside already knows it too. The silence that followed felt heavier than the insult itself. For 18 years, I had lived inside this house feeling like an unwanted guest. Tonight was supposed to be the moment they threw me out. Instead, it was the moment everything they believed about me was about to fall apart. I grew up in the Winslow house, but it never truly felt like my home. From the outside, it looked like the kind of place people admired. It was a large brick house on a quiet suburban street, with trimmed hedges and a long driveway where my stepfather liked to park his newest car so the neighbors could see it. Daniel Winslow was a successful real estate developer, the kind of man who believed reputation was more important than kindness. My sister Catherine fit perfectly into the life he wanted to display. She was confident, popular, and always dressed in whatever expensive clothes Daniel had recently bought for her. I was the opposite. My name is Samantha Collins, and in that house I learned early that I was not part of the picture Daniel wanted the world to see. While Catherine was treated like the pride of the family, I moved quietly through the background of every room. Daniel rarely spoke to me unless he was correcting something I had done wrong. At dinner, he would ask Catherine about school, about her friends, about her plans for the future. When he looked at me at all, it was usually with the kind of expression someone gives a stranger who has stayed too long. Catherine understood the difference between us before either of us were even teenagers. She learned quickly that Daniel's approval meant power in our house. If she wanted something, she only had to ask. When she turned 16, Daniel bought her a car and announced it proudly to relatives during a family barbecue. That same summer, I asked him for help paying the fee to take my SAT exam. He told me if I wanted something, I should earn it myself. So I did. I worked after school at a small cafe a few blocks away, saving tips in a jar hidden in my room until I had enough to register for the test. None of this surprised me by then. By the time I reached high school, I had already accepted that I would have to build my future without anyone in that house helping me. The only person who ever tried to protect me from that reality was my mother, Laura Collins. She had a quiet strength that balanced the tension in the house, and when she was around, Daniel's sharp words didn't feel quite as heavy. But when I was 12, she died after a long fight with cancer, and the house became colder than I ever thought possible. 3 days before she passed away, my mother asked me to promise something. She told me there was a small wooden box hidden in her bedroom, and inside it was a letter meant only for me. She made me swear not to open it until I turned 16. At the time, I didn't understand why she was so serious about it. I only knew that whatever was written inside that letter mattered enough for her to guard it until the very end of her life. For 4 years, that box stayed hidden in the back of my closet while the rest of my life moved forward. I went to school, worked at the cafe, and watched the distance between me and the rest of the family grow wider every year. But in the back of my mind, I carried a quiet certainty that one day the truth inside that letter would explain everything Daniel had never said out loud. And when I finally opened it, I realized that the story of my family was far more complicated than anyone in that dining room understood. I was 8 years old the night I learned something was wrong with my place in that house. It was late, and I had gotten up to get a glass of water because I couldn't sleep. The hallway lights were off, but I could see the kitchen light glowing under the door. I heard my mother's voice first, quiet but tense, the way she sounded when she was trying not to start an argument. Daniel's voice was louder. I remember standing in the hallway with my bare feet on the cold floor, frozen when I heard my name. "She's not mine, Laura," Daniel said sharply. "You should have told me the truth from the beginning." My mother answered quickly, almost whispering. "She's still a child, Daniel. She doesn't deserve to grow up hearing things like that." Daniel let out a short, bitter laugh. "That's not my problem. I married you, not the mistake another man left behind." I didn't understand everything he meant, but I understood enough to know the conversation was about me. I stood there in the dark hallway, barely breathing, afraid that if they heard me, they would stop talking. My mother said something I couldn't hear clearly, and then Daniel's voice rose again. "I'm not throwing her out now. I'm not that cruel, but the day she turns 18, I'm done pretending she belongs here." Those words stayed with me longer than anything else I heard that night. The day she turns 18. Even at 8 years old, I understood what that meant. It meant my time in that house had an expiration date. I quietly walked back to my room without getting the water I came for. I lay awake staring at the ceiling until the morning sun came through the window. I didn't tell anyone what I had heard. I didn't even ask my mother about it. Something inside me knew that if I brought it up, everything would change in ways I wasn't ready to face. From that night forward, I watched the family around me differently. The small things I used to ignore suddenly started making sense. Daniel's distant behavior, the way he treated Catherine compared to me, even the way relatives sometimes looked at me with quiet curiosity during family gatherings. The difference between Catherine's life and mine became more obvious as we grew older. She was the center of attention in every situation. Daniel praised her grades, her hobbies, her social life. When she walked into a room, he smiled. When I walked into the same room, he usually didn't notice. By the time Catherine turned 16, the contrast was impossible to ignore. One afternoon, I came home from school and saw a red convertible parked in the driveway with a giant ribbon on the hood. Catherine was standing beside it with her hands over her mouth, while Daniel held up a set of keys like he was presenting a trophy. Several neighbors had gathered on the sidewalk to watch the moment. Daniel explained proudly that every daughter deserved a reward for her hard work. A few weeks later, I asked him if he could help me pay the fee for my SAT exam. I had been studying for months and knew I had a chance to score well, but the registration cost was more money than I could spare at the time. Daniel barely looked up from the papers on his desk when I asked. "If you want something," he said, "earn it yourself." That was when I started working at the cafe down the street. It was a small place called Morning Tide, and the owner didn't ask many questions as long as I showed up on time and worked hard. I spent afternoons clearing tables, washing cups, and counting tips into a jar I kept hidden in my room. The strange thing was that I didn't feel angry about it. Not really. By then, I had already accepted that my future wouldn't come from anything Daniel gave me. It would come from whatever I managed to build on my own. My mother tried to soften the distance whenever she could. She would sit with me at the kitchen table late at night while I finished homework and ask about my classes. Sometimes she would bring me tea and quietly apologize for things she never explained. I never asked her what she meant. I just appreciated the way she looked at me, like I mattered. But her health began to fail during my early teenage years, and the house slowly changed as the hospital visits became more frequent. The tension that had always existed between Daniel and me grew sharper after that. Catherine seemed to move even closer to him, as if she knew instinctively that aligning herself with Daniel meant security. Through all of it, I carried the memory of that conversation in the kitchen like a secret that only I knew. I didn't understand every detail yet, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. The countdown to my 18th birthday had already begun. After that night in the hallway, something inside me quietly shifted. I stopped expecting warmth from Daniel, and instead I began watching everything around me with a kind of careful attention that most children never develop. It was easier that way. When you stop expecting kindness, disappointment stops surprising you. The differences between Catherine and me became clearer every year. Daniel treated her achievements like family victories, something worth celebrating in front of everyone. When she brought home good grades, he told relatives about them at dinner. When she joined clubs at school, he attended every event and sat in the front row like a proud parent. I was there too sometimes, but mostly in the background, sitting quietly and clapping along with everyone else. When I brought home my own report cards, Daniel usually glanced at them for a few seconds before setting them aside. Once I scored near the top of my class on a major exam and mentioned it during dinner. Catherine laughed and said something about how teachers always favored quiet students because they were easier to manage. Daniel didn't correct her. He just continued eating like the conversation had already ended. By high school, the difference between our lives had become almost routine. Catherine received things automatically. I learned to earn them. When she turned 16, Daniel bought her a brand new car and invited several neighbors to watch her unwrap the keys in the driveway. Catherine squealed with excitement and hugged him in front of everyone while phones came out to capture the moment. A few weeks later, I asked Daniel if he could help me pay the fee for my SAT exam. I had studied for months and knew the test could help me get scholarships for college. The cost wasn't enormous, but it was more than I had saved at the time. Daniel was sitting in his office reviewing construction plans when I knocked on the door. "I need $200 for the registration fee," I said carefully. He didn't even look up. "Then get a job." That was the entire conversation. No discussion, no encouragement, just the simple expectation that if I wanted a future, I would have to build it without him. So I did exactly that. I found a job at a small cafe called Morning Tide a few blocks from school. The place smelled like roasted coffee beans and warm bread, and the owner didn't care that I was still a student as long as I worked hard and showed up on time. I spent afternoons clearing tables, washing cups, and serving pastries to customers who rarely noticed the tired teenager behind the counter. Every dollar I earned went into a small jar hidden in the back of my closet. Slowly, the jar filled with enough money for the SAT fee, then for textbooks, then for other small expenses that teenagers usually expect their parents to cover. I never asked Daniel for help again. The only person who ever seemed aware of the quiet imbalance in our house was my mother. Laura Collins had a way of noticing things no one else said out loud. Sometimes she would sit beside me at the kitchen table late at night while I finished homework. She would bring me tea and ask about school in a gentle voice that made the house feel less cold. During those moments, I almost forgot about the conversation I had overheard years earlier. Almost. But the memory never disappeared completely. It lingered in the back of my mind like a shadow that stretched across every part of my life. When I was 12, my mother became sick. At first, it was small things that no one treated seriously. She was tired more often. She canceled plans she would normally keep. Then came the hospital visits and the quiet conversations behind closed doors. Eventually, the doctors said the word cancer, and the house changed in a way that no one could pretend not to notice. I spent more time with her than anyone else did. Catherine visited occasionally, but her life continued mostly the same. Daniel appeared at the hospital when necessary, but he rarely stayed long. Work always seemed to pull him away. One evening, a few days before she died, my mother asked the nurse to give us a few minutes alone. The room felt strangely peaceful in the soft afternoon light coming through the window. She reached for my hand and squeezed it gently. "Samantha," she said, her voice weaker than I had ever heard it, "there's something important I need you to keep safe." She told me about a small wooden box hidden in her bedroom at home, a box with carved patterns on the lid. Inside it, she explained, was a letter meant only for me. But she made me promise that I would not open it until I turned 16. "You'll understand when the time comes," she said softly. I promised because she asked me to, even though I had no idea what the letter contained. 3 days later, she was gone, and the house felt emptier than it ever had before. I kept the wooden box exactly where she said it would be, hidden in the back of my closet behind old winter coats. For 4 years, I lived with the quiet knowledge that whatever truth my mother had left behind was waiting inside that box. And every day that passed brought me one step closer to the moment I would finally open it. I woke up earlier than usual on the morning of my 16th birthday, long before the alarm clock had a chance to ring. The house was unusually quiet because Daniel had already left for work, and Catherine had gone to school early for some club meeting she had been talking about all week. For the first time in years, the Winslow house felt empty enough for me to breathe without tension pressing against my chest. I sat on the edge of my bed for several minutes, staring at the closet door. Behind that door, hidden behind a stack of winter coats, was the small wooden box my mother had told me about 4 years earlier. I had thought about it almost every day since she died. Sometimes I imagined the letter inside explaining the argument I overheard when I was 8. Other times I convinced myself it would only contain something small and sentimental, something meant to comfort me rather than reveal a secret. But my mother's expression in that hospital room had never looked like someone leaving behind a simple message. It looked like someone protecting the truth until the right moment. I finally stood up and opened the closet. My hands felt strangely unsteady as I reached behind the coats and pulled the box out into the light. The carved patterns on the lid were familiar because I had seen the box many times before when my mother kept it on her dresser, but holding it now felt different. It felt heavier than I remembered, not because of its weight, but because of what it might contain. I carried it back to my bed and sat down again, turning it slowly in my hands before lifting the lid. Inside was a single envelope. My name was written on the front in my mother's handwriting. For a moment, I just stared at it. Seeing her handwriting again felt like hearing her voice after years of silence. I opened the envelope carefully and unfolded the letter. The first lines confirmed something I had suspected for a long time. Daniel Winslow was not my biological father. My mother explained that years before she married Daniel, she had been involved with another man named Jonathan Blake. Their relationship ended before she realized she was pregnant, and by the time she discovered the truth, he had already moved away for work. She wrote that she had tried to reach him once but never received a response. When Daniel came into her life later, she believed she could create a stable family for me even without telling Jonathan about the pregnancy. Reading those words felt like watching pieces of my childhood rearrange themselves into a clearer picture. The distance between Daniel and me suddenly made sense in a way it never had before. My mother continued writing about the moment Daniel eventually discovered the truth. When I was 3 years old, he found documents confirming that he was not my father. According to her letter, he reacted with anger and humiliation, but he chose not to expose the situation publicly. He believed admitting the truth would damage his reputation, so he stayed in the marriage but carried resentment that never disappeared. As I read those sentences, I remembered the conversation I overheard in the kitchen when I was 8. The words in the letter matched the tone of that argument perfectly. Near the end of the letter, my mother revealed something I never expected. She wrote that Jonathan Blake had never known I existed. He had built a career in another state, eventually becoming a powerful figure in business and politics. She admitted she had followed his success quietly over the years, but never told him about me because she feared losing custody in a legal battle. However, she also wrote that I deserved the right to know the truth and decide for myself whether to contact him. To make that possible, she had left copies of important documents with a lawyer named Margaret Doyle, who could confirm everything if I chose to pursue it. When I finished reading the letter, I sat in silence for a long time. The quiet house around me felt different now, like a place I had lived in but never truly belonged to. Eventually, I opened my laptop and typed Jonathan Blake's name into a search engine. The results appeared instantly. Articles, interviews, photographs. He was not just successful, he was influential. His work in politics and development projects had made him one of the most recognized figures in the state. As I scrolled through the articles, another detail caught my attention. Several reports mentioned business contracts connected to city development projects. Some of those projects involved companies that had competed directly with Daniel's firm. In more than one case, Jonathan Blake's office had supported proposals that Daniel had failed to secure. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen. The situation suddenly felt far more complicated than a simple family secret. My biological father was not just a stranger living somewhere else. He was a man whose decisions had already crossed paths with the man who raised me. I closed the laptop slowly, my mind racing with possibilities. The letter in my hands had answered the question that haunted my childhood. But it had also opened the door to a future I had never imagined before. For several days after reading my mother's letter, I carried it everywhere like something fragile that might disappear if I left it alone too long. I folded it carefully and kept it inside my notebook, pulling it out whenever I found a quiet moment after school or during a slow shift at the cafe. Each time I read it again, the same name seemed to stand out more clearly than everything else: Jonathan Blake. At first, the idea of contacting him felt impossible. His name appeared constantly in the news articles I found online. Interviews about economic development, photographs from political events, reports about major infrastructure projects he helped negotiate. He seemed less like a person and more like a distant figure whose life existed on an entirely different level from mine. Still, the last lines of my mother's letter refused to leave my mind. She had written that I deserved the right to know where I came from and decide what to do with that truth. Ignoring the letter would mean living the rest of my life wondering what might have happened if I had tried. So one evening after work, I sat at the small desk in my room and began writing a letter of my own. I kept the message simple. I introduced myself as Samantha Collins and explained that I believed he might be my biological father. I included a photocopy of my mother's letter and asked for only one thing: a DNA test to confirm whether the story was true. I wrote that I did not expect anything from him except the truth. When I finished, I stared at the envelope for a long time before sealing it. The next afternoon, I walked to the post office after my shift at the cafe and stood in front of the outgoing mail slot with the envelope in my hands. Dropping it inside felt like pushing a door open without knowing what waited on the other side. 3 weeks passed without any response. During those weeks, I tried to act like nothing had changed. I went to school, studied for exams, and continued working at morning tide. But every afternoon I checked the mailbox before going inside the house. Each time it was empty, I told myself I had expected that. A man like Jonathan Blake probably received hundreds of letters every week. Mine could easily have disappeared among them. Then one afternoon I opened the mailbox and saw a thick envelope addressed to Samantha Collins. My hands trembled as I pulled it out. The return address belonged to a law office in the state capitol. Inside was a letter from an attorney named Margaret Doyle. The name immediately caught my attention because my mother had mentioned it in her letter. Margaret explained that Jonathan Blake had received my message and taken it seriously. Before making any assumptions, he wanted to confirm the truth through a private DNA test. Margaret included instructions for scheduling an appointment at a certified laboratory in the city. The test would remain confidential until results were confirmed. I read the letter twice before the reality of it fully settled in. Someone had read my letter. Someone had believed it was worth investigating. The appointment took place a week later in a quiet medical office downtown. The procedure itself was simple. A technician swabbed the inside of my cheek and collected a small sample before sealing it in a labeled container. The entire process lasted less than 10 minutes, but the waiting afterward felt endless. 2 weeks later, another envelope arrived. I opened it in my bedroom with the door closed, my heart beating so loudly it almost drowned out the sound of the paper unfolding. The report confirmed what my mother had written. Jonathan Blake was my biological father with overwhelming probability. That evening, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. I answered cautiously, expecting it to be a mistake. Instead, a calm male voice introduced himself. "Samantha," he said gently, "this is Jonathan Blake." For a moment, I couldn't find the words to respond. Hearing his voice made the situation feel suddenly real in a way the documents hadn't. He explained that he had just read the DNA results and was still trying to understand how he could have a daughter he had never known about. He told me he didn't blame my mother for the choices she made and that he wanted to meet me whenever I felt ready. We met 2 weeks later at a quiet cafe halfway between the city and my neighborhood. When he walked in, the first thing I noticed was how similar our eyes looked. It was a strange realization, seeing a part of myself reflected in someone I had only just met. We talked for nearly 2 hours. He asked about my life, my school, and how I had grown up. I didn't tell him every painful detail about the Winslow house, but I shared enough for him to understand the distance that existed there. Near the end of our conversation, another subject came up. Jonathan mentioned that my mother had once told him she planned to create a financial trust for my future. Curious about that, I contacted Margaret Doyle again later that week. Her response revealed something unexpected. My mother had indeed established a trust fund before she died, and Daniel Winslow had been listed as the trustee responsible for managing it until I turned 18. But Margaret also said some of the financial records looked unusual, and for the first time, I realized the truth about my family might involve more than just a hidden father. The dining room still smelled like roasted chicken and wine when I placed the envelope on the table. My 18th birthday party had been loud and cheerful only minutes earlier, but now the room felt tense enough to make every movement seem louder than it should be. The $1 bill Catherine had thrown at me lay crumpled beside my plate. Daniel was the first to speak. "What is this supposed to be?" he asked, his voice sharp with irritation. I slid the envelope forward slightly. "Proof," I said calmly. Catherine laughed from the head of the table. "You really think waving around some paper is going to change anything?" she said. "Everyone here already knows the truth." I opened the envelope slowly and removed the documents inside. The first page was the DNA report confirming that Jonathan Blake was my biological father. The second was the letter my mother wrote before she died. I placed both documents flat on the table where everyone could see them. Daniel leaned forward and picked up the DNA report. At first he looked annoyed, as if he expected it to be some childish attempt at drama. But the longer he read, the more his expression changed. His eyebrows tightened, and the color slowly drained from his face. Catherine leaned over his shoulder. "What does it say?" she demanded. Daniel didn't answer immediately. He stared at the paper for several seconds before looking up at me. "This is fake," he said finally. "You think you can embarrass me with some made-up test?" I shook my head. "You already knew the truth," I said quietly. "You knew it for years." The room fell silent again. A few relatives shifted in their chairs, clearly uncomfortable with how serious the conversation had become. "You told Mom that when I turned 18 you wouldn't have to pretend anymore," I continued. "I heard you say it when I was 8 years old." Daniel's jaw tightened. Catherine crossed her arms, her confident smile fading slightly. "You're lying," she snapped. "You always try to make everything about you." I didn't respond to her. Instead, I pointed toward the front window of the house. "It doesn't matter whether you believe me," I said, "because the person who can confirm everything is already outside." Several guests turned toward the window instinctively. Through the glass, they could see a line of black vehicles parked along the curb. Even from across the room, the sight was impossible to ignore. Daniel stood abruptly and walked toward the window for a closer look. His shoulders stiffened the moment he recognized one of the cars. Before he could say anything, the doorbell rang. The sound echoed through the quiet house like the beginning of something official. Every conversation stopped. Every pair of eyes turned toward the front hallway. I stood up from the table and walked to the door. My hands were steady, even though my heart was racing. When I opened it, Jonathan Blake stood on the porch beside 2 security officers and Margaret Doyle. For a brief moment, we simply looked at each other. The last time we met had been in a quiet cafe where no one else paid attention to us. Tonight was different. "Are you ready?" Jonathan asked quietly. I nodded and stepped aside so they could enter. When Jonathan walked into the dining room, several guests recognized him immediately. A few whispered his name under their breath. Catherine's face went pale as she realized who was standing in front of her. Daniel recovered first. "You need to leave my house," he said firmly. Jonathan ignored the demand and walked calmly toward the table where the documents lay. Margaret Doyle followed, holding a folder of additional papers. "I'm not here for an argument," Jonathan said evenly. "I'm here because Samantha is my daughter." The words hung in the air like a final verdict. Margaret stepped forward and placed several documents beside the DNA report. "Before Laura Collins passed away," she explained, "she established a trust fund intended for Samantha's education and future expenses." Daniel's expression hardened. "And?" Margaret opened the folder and removed several printed bank statements. "You were appointed trustee responsible for managing those funds until Samantha turned 18, she continued. "However, during a recent review of the account, we discovered multiple withdrawals that do not appear connected to Samantha's welfare." A murmur spread through the room. Daniel tried to laugh it off. That money was used to support the household she lived in. Margaret shook her head slightly. The records indicate that several transfers were directed toward development investments tied to your company. The guests who had come to celebrate my birthday now watched the scene like witnesses to something far more serious. Catherine looked from her father to the documents on the table, her earlier confidence completely gone. Jonathan finally spoke again, his voice calm but unmistakably firm. "Samantha has spent her entire life believing she didn't belong here," he said. "That ends tonight." No one in the room argued with him, because the truth sitting on the table had already changed everything. 1 week after my 18th birthday, the story that had begun in our dining room was no longer a secret. Word spread quietly at first, carried through the same social circles where Daniel had spent years building his reputation. Several guests from the party had witnessed Jonathan Blake walking into the house with legal counsel, and that alone was enough to start conversations Daniel could not control. I wasn't living in the Winslow house anymore. Jonathan arranged a temporary apartment for me near the city center, while Margaret Doyle continued reviewing the trust fund records. The apartment was small compared to the house I grew up in, but it felt peaceful in a way that place never had. For the first time in my life, I woke up in the morning without feeling like I had to justify my presence in someone else's home. The legal process moved quickly. Margaret and her team spent days reviewing financial statements connected to the trust my mother created. The records showed patterns that were impossible to ignore. Withdrawals had been made over several years, often around the same time Daniel's development company began new projects. Each transaction raised another question about how the money intended for my education had actually been used. While that investigation continued, another event approached that Daniel had been planning for months. The city's annual Development Council Gala was scheduled for the following Friday night. It was the kind of event where business leaders, investors, and politicians gathered in one room to celebrate major projects and partnerships. Daniel had expected to receive an award recognizing his company's contributions to several new construction developments. Jonathan was also scheduled to attend, but for a different reason. As one of the state's most influential political figures, he had been invited to give the keynote speech. When he mentioned the event to me, I understood immediately why it mattered. What happened in the Winslow house had exposed the truth privately. The gala would reveal it publicly. The ballroom that night was enormous, filled with round tables covered in white cloth and soft golden lighting reflecting off tall glass windows. Hundreds of guests filled the room, their conversations blending together in a low murmur that sounded almost like background music. I entered beside Jonathan, trying to keep my breathing steady. Many people recognized him the moment he walked in and greeted him with polite handshakes and respectful smiles. Across the room, I spotted Daniel sitting at a table near the stage with Catherine beside him. He looked confident at first, talking with 2 investors from his company. Then he noticed us walking in. The expression on his face changed instantly. Catherine leaned toward him and whispered something urgently, but Daniel kept his eyes fixed on us as if trying to calculate what would happen next. The event host eventually stepped onto the stage and welcomed everyone to the evening's program. After several introductions, he invited Jonathan Blake to deliver the keynote speech. Jonathan walked to the podium calmly, adjusting the microphone before beginning. At first, his speech sounded like the kind of formal remarks people expected at an event like this. He spoke about leadership, responsibility, and the role of ethical decision-making in business and public service. The audience listened politely, nodding along as he described the importance of trust between companies, investors, and communities. Then his tone shifted slightly. "Sometimes," he said, pausing for a moment, "the greatest tests of integrity don't happen in boardrooms or public offices. They happen in families." The room grew quieter as people realized his speech was becoming more personal than expected. Jonathan looked toward the front row where I was seated and extended his hand. "I'd like to introduce someone important," he said. I stood and walked toward the stage. The movement caused whispers to ripple through the audience as hundreds of eyes turned toward us. "This is Samantha Collins," Jonathan continued. "She is my daughter." The words landed like a sudden shock across the ballroom. Conversations stopped instantly. Jonathan explained briefly how we had discovered our connection and how a series of legal documents had confirmed the truth. He didn't raise his voice or accuse anyone directly. Instead, he simply described the facts in calm, measured sentences. Margaret Doyle then stepped forward carrying a folder. She explained that my mother had established a trust fund intended to support my education and future independence. Daniel Winslow had been appointed trustee responsible for managing those funds until I turned 18. But during a recent review, she continued, we discovered significant financial transfers from that account which appear unrelated to Samantha's benefit. The room filled with quiet murmurs. Daniel stood abruptly from his table. "This is outrageous," he said loudly. "You're twisting facts to damage my reputation." Margaret didn't react to his anger. She simply held up several documents showing the bank records connected to the withdrawals. The evidence spoke louder than any argument. Several guests at Daniel's table slowly pushed their chairs back, creating distance between themselves and the situation. Catherine stared at the floor, her earlier confidence completely gone. Jonathan's final words were simple. "Samantha spent 18 years believing she was a mistake," he said calmly. "Tonight, the truth finally belongs to her." Daniel left the ballroom before the speech ended. The moment the doors closed behind him, the room erupted with whispers and speculation. For the first time in my life, the story that had once made me feel invisible was being heard by everyone. 3 months after the gala, the city had already moved on to new headlines, but the consequences of that night were still unfolding quietly in the background of Daniel Winslow's life. The legal case regarding my trust fund progressed faster than I expected. Margaret Doyle and her team had assembled years of bank records, transaction histories, and investment statements connected to the account my mother created before she died. The pattern was clear once everything was placed side by side. Withdrawals from the trust had repeatedly coincided with funding gaps in Daniel's development projects. When the documents were finally presented in court, Daniel's defense was simple. He claimed every financial decision had been made in the interest of maintaining the household where I lived, but the numbers told a different story. Several transfers were traced directly into business ventures that had nothing to do with my education or welfare. The judge didn't take long to reach a decision. Daniel was ordered to repay the full amount that had been withdrawn from the trust, along with additional financial penalties for violating his responsibilities as trustee. For most of my childhood, Daniel had controlled the narrative about who I was and where I belonged. Now the truth existed in official records that no one could rewrite. His company felt the impact almost immediately. Investors who once praised his leadership quietly withdrew their support, explaining that they preferred not to be connected to a legal controversy. Within weeks, Daniel stepped down from his position as head of the firm while the remaining projects were reorganized under new management. The strange thing was that I didn't feel triumph watching it happen. I mostly felt something closer to closure. The story of my life had never been about revenge. It had always been about finally being seen for who I was, instead of the version of me someone else created. My own life was changing in quieter ways. Jonathan helped me move into a small apartment near the university where I would begin classes that fall. The place was modest, with large windows that looked out toward a line of old maple trees along the street. I furnished it slowly with second-hand shelves, a small desk, and the textbooks I had saved money to buy. For the first time in my life, the space around me belonged entirely to me. Jonathan and I met often during those months, usually for lunch or coffee. We talked about my classes, about the career paths I was considering, and sometimes about the strange reality of building a father-daughter relationship after 18 years apart. He never tried to replace the years we lost with dramatic gestures. Instead, he simply showed up. And somehow that meant more than anything else he could have offered. Catherine disappeared almost completely from the social circles where she once thrived. After the gala, people began whispering about the Winslow family in ways that made public appearances uncomfortable for her. I heard through relatives that she had moved to another city and was trying to rebuild her life somewhere no one recognized her name. I didn't hate her. The anger I once felt had faded into something quieter. Catherine had spent years believing she understood exactly who I was. In the end, the truth proved that none of us had understood the whole story. Sometimes I still think back to that night at the dining table, the dollar bill sliding across the table, the words Daniel said about there being no place for me in his house. He was right about one thing. That house was never truly meant to be my home. My real life began the moment I walked away from it. On the first day of the semester, I stood by the window of my apartment watching students cross the campus courtyard below. The air carried that early autumn chill that always signals the beginning of something new. For 18 years, I believed I was the mistake someone else wanted to hide. Now I understood something much simpler. I was never the mistake. I was the truth that had been waiting to be heard. And if you've ever felt like the outsider in your own family, like the person everyone else underestimated or misunderstood, I'd genuinely like to hear your story too. Tell me in the comments what you would have done in my place. Would you have confronted them the way I did, or would you have chosen to walk away without looking back? Your experiences matter more than you might think, and reading them helps build a community where stories like this don't stay hidden. If this story meant something to you, stay with the channel for more real stories about family, truth, and the moment when people finally reclaim their lives. And if you want to hear the next one, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it. This story is fictional. Any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental.